A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was trying to buy a simple pack of mechanical pencil leads yesterday, something that usually costs maybe $3, and by the time I got to the final checkout screen, the total was closer to $30. It was a complete shock. I actually thought the app was glitching, or maybe I had accidentally added a 0 to the quantity. I refreshed the page, cleared my cache, even tried a different browser, but the number stayed the same. $29.82 for a tiny plastic tube of graphite.
That is the reality of the post-de minimis world we are living in now, corn. What you experienced is the direct result of the regulatory hammer that dropped in late 25. For years, we lived in this bubble where the friction of international borders just didn't seem to apply to small consumer goods. But as of August 29, 25, that bubble didn't just pop, it was vaporized. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that, the evolution of AliExpress from this chaotic, Wild West marketplace into something much more structured, and why that transition is being forced by these massive geopolitical shifts.
It feels like the era of the $4 miracle is officially dead, at least for those of us in the United States. We talked about that miracle back in episode 815. The idea that you could ship a tiny plastic component halfway across the world for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Back then, the logistics were so subsidized and the tax loopholes were so wide that you could essentially ignore the fact that the Pacific Ocean existed. But now, it feels like the wall has finally been built, and it is a very expensive wall to climb.
It is a massive pivot point. For years, AliExpress operated in this gray zone where individual packages were small enough to fly under the radar of customs duties thanks to the de minimis exemption. In the US, that threshold was $800. If your package was worth less than that, it came in duty-free and with minimal paperwork. But the US government effectively eliminated that for Chinese goods last year. Now, we are seeing 30% duties or even flat processing fees of $25 to $50 per item on goods entering the US. It has completely upended the unit economics of the platform. If you are buying a $200 drone, a 30% tax is annoying. If you are buying a $3 pack of pencil leads, a $25 flat fee is a death sentence for that transaction.
Before we get into the tragedy of my $30 pencil leads and the broader economic fallout, we should probably define what AliExpress actually is, because even after all these years, people still confuse it with its parent company. When Daniel asks if it is just a side hustle for the B2B business, I think that is a really common misconception that stems from how the company started.
It is a huge distinction that we need to clear up. Alibaba.com is the original behemoth founded by Jack Ma in the late 90s. That is strictly business to business. That is where you go if you want to order 5,000 custom-branded silicone spatulas for your kitchenware startup. You negotiate with a factory representative, you deal with minimum order quantities, you arrange freight forwarding, and you handle complex customs bonds. AliExpress, which sits under the Alibaba International Digital Commerce Unit, or AIDC, is the consumer-facing side. It is the retail layer. And to answer Daniel's question, it is definitely not a side hustle anymore.
The numbers certainly back that up. I was looking at the fiscal reports for the year ending March 25, and AIDC posted 46% revenue growth, reaching over $14 billion. That is roughly 10% of the entire Alibaba Group's total revenue. We are talking about a platform that moved over $100 billion in gross merchandise value in 25. That is not a side project. That is a global titan that is outpacing the growth of the broader cross-border e-commerce market.
And it is important to understand where AliExpress fits in the AIEC family. It is the flagship, but it is joined by other regional heavyweights like Lazada in Southeast Asia, Trendyol in Turkey and Europe, and Daraz in South Asia. But AliExpress is the one that tries to be everywhere at once. However, it is a powerhouse with a bit of an identity crisis because, unlike Amazon, AliExpress isn't actually a store. It doesn't own the inventory, at least not in the traditional sense.
That is the core of the model that trips people up. It is a marketplace and an escrow service. When you buy something on AliExpress, you're not buying it from Alibaba. You are buying it from one of thousands of independent vendors, ranging from actual factories to small trading companies, or even just guys with a laptop doing dropshipping.
That is why the experience has historically been so fragmented. AliExpress holds your money in escrow and only releases it to the seller once you confirm you have received the item. That was their original trust innovation. But because you are dealing with individual vendors, the customer service experience was basically a digital cage match. If you got a broken item, you weren't talking to a corporate customer service department, you were dealing with a guy in Shenzhen who might be using a translation app and who is operating on such thin margins that a single refund could wipe out his profit for the day. He has very little incentive to be helpful.
Which explains why the service has historically been, let's say, less than stellar. It was a buyer beware environment, but that is changing with this choice program they have been pushing. I see the choice label on almost everything now. It feels like they are trying to put a professional coat of paint over the chaos.
The choice program is the most important strategic shift in the history of the platform, and it is AliExpress's direct answer to the customer service problem. They realized that the pure marketplace model had a ceiling. If they wanted to compete with local retailers or Amazon, they had to solve the trust gap and the shipping speed gap. Under Choice, which launched in early 23 but really became the dominant model in 25, AliExpress takes over the logistics and the quality control.
So they basically told the vendors, look, you make the stuff, but we will handle the rest?
Essentially, yes. They told the high-performing vendors to send their best-selling inventory to AliExpress managed warehouses. Once the goods are in the warehouse, AliExpress handles the shipping, the returns, and the customer service. It is their version of Amazon FBA, or Fulfilled by Amazon. And the impact has been massive. Choice now accounts for over 70% of all AliExpress orders. It turns the platform from a gamble into something that feels like a real retail experience. You get guaranteed delivery times, sometimes as fast as 5 days globally, and a much simpler return process because you are shipping it back to a local or regional AliExpress hub, not all the way back to a factory in China.
It changes the economics for the sellers too, doesn't it? I imagine they aren't thrilled about giving up that control or paying the extra fees.
They lose a bit of margin to the platform fees, but they get much higher visibility in the search results and much better conversion rates because people trust the Choice badge. But here is the thing, corn, even with the Choice program, the underlying supply chain is still that Shanzai ecosystem we discussed in episode 1363. These are the same factories that produce for major Western brands. They have the molds, they have the raw materials, and they have the expertise. They are just selling the unbranded or white label versions directly to the consumer.
Which is why the quality can be surprisingly high if you know what you are looking for. You are essentially bypassing the 500% markup that a Western brand would add for the logo, the marketing, and the physical storefront. You are buying the utility of the product without the status of the brand, but now that the US has removed that de minimis exemption, that price advantage is being eaten alive by taxes and fees. I am curious about the leadership behind this, because it feels like a very coordinated, aggressive pivot to survive this new era.
That would be Jiang Fan. He is a fascinating figure in the Chinese tech world and someone we should really pay attention to. He is only 39, making him the youngest member of the Alibaba Partner Committee. He was originally the architect behind the mobile transformation of Taobao, which is their domestic giant in China. He basically turned it from a website into a mobile-first social shopping experience. After some personal controversies, he was moved to run the international division, which many thought was a demotion at the time.
But it turned out to be the exact opposite. He took that international unit and turned it into a growth engine.
He applied the same aggressive, data-driven tactics he used at Taobao to AliExpress. And in mid-25, Alibaba made a massive structural move. They consolidated the domestic and international e-commerce arms into a single e-commerce business group with Jiang Fan at the helm. This was a massive signal to the market. It means Alibaba is no longer looking at international as a separate experiment or a side hustle. They are trying to build a unified global supply chain that moves goods from Chinese factories to anywhere in the world with the same efficiency they have inside China. They want to treat a customer in Madrid or Sao Paulo the same way they treat a customer in Shanghai.
It is a bold move, but the map of where they are winning looks very different than it did 5 years ago. We tend to be very US-centric in our view, especially when we are complaining about our pencil leads. But AliExpress is absolutely dominant in places where Amazon hasn't been able to crack the code, or hasn't even tried.
Their geographic footprint is really the key to understanding why they are still growing despite the US tariff war. They are huge in Spain, France, Brazil, and Poland. In many of these markets, they haven't just built a website. They have built their own physical logistics networks through Cainiao, which is Alibaba's logistics arm. In Brazil, for example, they have been growing at nearly 20% year over year. They didn't just wait for the local mail to get better, they worked out deals with the local postal service, built regional sorting centers, and even chartered their own cargo planes to fly directly into the country.
It is interesting that they thrive where the logistics are difficult. Amazon loves a neat, predictable market with great infrastructure. AliExpress seems to excel in the chaos of emerging markets where people are more price sensitive and the local retail options are either too expensive or just non-existent.
Precisely. In Spain and Poland, they have installed thousands of self-service lockers, similar to Amazon lockers, but they are often more ubiquitous. They are winning in the markets where they can provide a level of variety that no local store could ever match. But I keep coming back to that de minimis change in the US. If 78% of their growth is coming from emerging markets, does that mean they are just giving up on the US consumer?
I don't think they are giving up, but they are definitely being forced to change their tactics. For a long time, the US was low-hanging fruit because of that $800 threshold. You could ship millions of small packages, duty-free, and the US Postal Service would even deliver them at a discount thanks to old international treaty rates. Now that the threshold is essentially zero for Chinese goods, the only way for them to stay competitive in the US is to move to a regional warehousing model. They have to ship goods in bulk by sea, pay the commercial duties up front, and store them in US warehouses.
Which makes them look even more like Amazon. It removes the direct from factory advantage and adds the massive overhead of domestic storage, labor, and insurance. It is a complete reversal of the model that made them famous. The $4 miracle was built on the idea that the warehouse was in China where land and labor are cheap. If the warehouse has to be in New Jersey or California, the miracle starts to look a lot more like a standard retail operation.
And it is also where they might lose their edge. The magic of AliExpress for a lot of people was the infinite variety, the long tail. You could find a specific obscure sensor for a 20-year-old dishwasher, or a very specific type of mechanical pencil lead that no one in the US would ever stock in a warehouse because the demand is too low. If they move to a US warehousing model, they will only stock the high-volume stuff, the phone cases, the chargers, the trendy kitchen gadgets. The weird niche items that made the platform a playground for nerds and makers will become prohibitively expensive because of those flat-rate customs fees on individual shipments.
That is the part that hurts the most for the hobbyist community. If I need a specific 5-cent capacitor for a repair project and the shipping and duty now cost $25, that project is just dead. It is not worth doing. We are seeing the end of the global hobbyist economy as we knew it. The friction has returned, and it is specifically targeting the small value, high variety trade.
It is a regulatory decoupling. The US government is essentially saying that the social and economic cost of these millions of uninspected, untaxed packages is too high. They are worried about everything from fentanyl precursors being hidden in small parcels to the impact on domestic brick-and-mortar retail that has to pay property taxes and higher wages. By killing de minimis, they are forcing these Chinese platforms to play by the same rules as a Target or a Walmart.
It is a massive shift in the geopolitical landscape, too. It is not just about the money, it is about control. If you control the gates, you control the flow. But let's talk about the vendors for a second. If I am a factory owner in Dongguan and my US orders just cratered because of these tariffs, what do? I don't just shut down the factory.
You pivot. You look at the other markets Jiang Fan is opening up. You look at Southeast Asia, where the middle class is exploding, or you look at Mexico and Brazil. The vendor ecosystem is incredibly resilient. These people are the masters of the side hustle. If one door closes, they find another. Many of them are also starting to use platforms like Temu, which is AliExpress's biggest rival right now. Temu has been even more aggressive with their pricing and their gamified app experience, though they are hitting the same regulatory walls in the US now.
The competition with Temu is actually pushing AliExpress to be better. I have noticed that the user interface on AliExpress has gotten a lot better in the last year. It used to feel like you were navigating a digital bazaar where every third link was broken and the translations were incomprehensible. Now it is surprisingly slick. They have clearly spent a lot of money on the interface, the recommendation algorithms, and the search functionality.
They had to. They are fighting for attention in a world where TikTok Shop and Temu are constantly shouting at consumers with flashing lights and free coupons. The goal now is to make the shopping experience feel seamless, almost invisible. They want you to forget that the item is coming from halfway across the world. That is why they are investing so heavily in their own cargo planes and their own sorting hubs. They want to get that delivery time down to 5 days globally. That is the holy grail for them, 5-day global delivery for the price of sea freight.
It sounds impossible, but they are getting close in some regions. I have seen choice items arrive in the UK or Spain in less than a week, but again, that relies on a very high volume, centralized logistics chain. It is a far cry from the original vision of AliExpress as a peer-to-peer marketplace where you were essentially buying something from a person on the other side of the planet.
The maturity of the platform is really the story here. It is growing up. It is becoming a legitimate global retail competitor. And that brings us back to Daniel's question about customer service. Is the era of customer service dead? I would argue that it is being automated and standardized. On the old AliExpress, customer service was a conversation, often a frustrating one. On the new AliExpress, especially with choice, customer service is a button. You click a button, you select the reason for the return, and the system generates a label. It is efficient, but it is impersonal.
It is the Amazonification of everything. We trade the personal touch and the lower price for predictability and ease of use, but I wonder if something is lost in that transition. There was a certain charm to finding a weird vendor who would actually customize a part for you if you chatted with them long enough. That still exists on Alibaba.com, the B2B side. That is where the real relationships are built. AliExpress is moving toward being a vending machine for the world. And as a vending machine, it is incredibly efficient, provided the government doesn't keep changing the price of the snacks.
Which they are clearly doing. The 30% duty is one thing, but those flat processing fees are the real killer for small items. It effectively sets a floor on the price of anything you can buy from overseas. If the fee is $25, there is no such thing as a $5 item anymore. The minimum price for anything entering the US from China is now essentially $28.
It creates a natural barrier that protects domestic sellers but also limits consumer choice. It is a classic protectionist move, and it is happening at a time when the US is trying to reshore a lot of manufacturing. The idea is that if you can't buy it for $5 from China, maybe you will buy it for $15 from a factory in Ohio. But for a lot of these high-variety, low-volume goods, there is no Ohio factory. They just won't exist in the US market anymore. We are losing access to the long tail of global production.
So we are looking at a future where AliExpress becomes the dominant player in the global south and parts of Europe, while the US becomes a sort of gated community for e-commerce. We will have our own silos of inventory, and the variety will be much narrower. We will have 10 versions of a spatula instead of 10,000.
That seems to be the trajectory. AliExpress is already shifting its focus. If you look at their marketing spend, it is heavily tilted toward international events like the Euro 24 and other major sports sponsorships outside the US. They are positioning themselves as a global brand, not just a Chinese one. And with Jiang Fan leading the charge, they are integrating their domestic successes like live stream shopping into the global app.
Live stream shopping is another one of those things that feels inevitable but also slightly exhausting. The idea of watching a host demonstrate a vegetable peeler for 20 minutes before you buy it. It is like the home shopping network but on steroids and directly on your phone.
It is huge in Southeast Asia, and it is starting to take off in Europe. It adds a layer of entertainment and, more importantly, trust. You see the product in action, you see the person behind it, and you can ask questions in real time. It is another way AliExpress is trying to solve the trust problem without traditional customer service. If you see the thing working on a live video, you are less worried about it being a piece of junk.
It is a fascinating evolution, from a scrappy escrow service for factory traders to a multi-billion-dollar global logistics giant. And yet, I am still annoyed about my pencil leads. I feel like I'm mourning a very specific era of the internet, the era where the world felt smaller and more accessible. There was a sense of wonder in ordering something from a factory in a city you had never heard of and having it show up in your mailbox 2 weeks later for the price of a sandwich.
It was an anomaly, corn. The period from roughly 2010 to 24 was a historical outlier where global trade was so frictionless and so subsidized by things like the Universal Postal Union and de minimis exemptions that we forgot that moving physical objects across oceans is actually very difficult and expensive. We are just returning to the historical norm where borders matter and logistics have a real cost. The miracle was actually just a series of temporary loopholes.
I suppose that is a fair way to look at it. We were living in a dream world of cheap plastic, and the bill has finally come due. But for people who still want to use AliExpress, what is the play now? How do you navigate this new landscape without getting hit by the $30 pencil lead surprise?
First, you have to look for the choice badge. If it is not a choice item, you are still in the Wild West. You are dealing with individual sellers, longer shipping times, and much higher risks of the package getting stuck in customs. Second, you have to do the math on the duties before you click buy. The platform is getting better at calculating these fees up front, but you need to assume that the price you see in the search results is just the starting point. If you are in the US, look for items that are already in US warehouses.
And what about the quality? Is there any way to filter out the junk? Or is it still just a matter of reading the reviews and hoping for the best?
The reviews are still your best tool, but you have to be a sophisticated reader of reviews. Look for the ones with photos and videos. The Shanzai ecosystem is very good at making things look great in professional renders, but the reality can be different. However, because of the choice program, AliExpress is now doing its own quality audits for high-volume items. They don't want the return costs, so they have a financial incentive to make sure the stuff they are shipping actually works. It is a weirdly optimistic take on corporate greed. They are forced to be better because being bad is getting too expensive.
It is a survival of the fittest for vendors. The ones who can provide consistent quality at a price that can absorb a 30% tariff are the ones who will survive. But it is a tough environment for the small guys, the individual artisan, or the tiny factory that doesn't have the volume to get into the choice program. They are the ones being squeezed out of the global market.
They are. We are seeing a massive consolidation of the vendor base. The platform is becoming more corporate, more professional, and less chaotic, which, depending on who you are, is either a great thing or a tragedy. If you are a casual shopper who just wants a cheap pair of headphones that work, it is a win. If you are a tinkerer who loves the hunt for the weird and the obscure, the golden age is over.
I think I fall into the latter category. I like the chaos. I like the feeling of finding something that felt like a secret. Now it just feels like shopping at a slightly cheaper, slightly more complicated version of Amazon. But I have to respect the sheer scale of what they are trying to pull off. It is a massive engineering and logistical challenge to move that much volume across so many borders.
It really is. And don't count out the Chinese manufacturing sector just yet. They are incredibly good at innovating around obstacles. We are already seeing them set up assembly plants in Mexico and Vietnam to bypass the direct China to US tariffs. They are building a more complex multinational web to keep the goods flowing. The logistics might change, and the labels might change, but the underlying engine of global production is still very much centered in that Pearl River Delta region.
It is a game of cat and mouse, and the mouse is very, very fast. I'm curious to see how the US responds if these regional hubs become the new norm. Do we start taxing everything based on the original source of the components? It feels like a rabbit hole that never ends.
It could lead to even more complex rules of origin requirements. But at a certain point, the cost of enforcement becomes higher than the revenue collected. That is the balance the regulators have to strike. They want to protect domestic industry, but they don't want to make life so difficult for consumers that it becomes a political liability. The de minimis change was a quiet regulatory move that had a massive, loud impact on millions of people's shopping habits.
And as we head deeper into 26, I think we are going to see even more of these kinds of shifts as the global economy continues to decouple. It is the end of the era of globalism, by default. Now, globalism is a choice, and it is an expensive one. AliExpress is the perfect case study for this. They are trying to build a bridge across a widening chasm, and they are doing it with some of the most sophisticated logistics technology in the world.
Whether that bridge stays open for U.S. consumers is still an open question, but for the rest of the world, the bridge is getting wider and faster. We are so used to being the center of the e-commerce universe, but Jiang Fan and the team at Alibaba are looking at a much bigger map. They are building for the next billion consumers in Brazil, Indonesia, and Nigeria. That is where the real growth is. The U.S. market is mature and increasingly hostile. The emerging markets are wide open and hungry for the kind of affordable variety that AliExpress provides.
Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground today. From the death of de minimis to the rise of the choice program and the strategic vision of Jiang Fan. It is a lot more complex than just a website for cheap junk. It is a fundamental part of the global economy that is being forced to grow up in a very difficult environment.
It is a story of maturation and adaptation. AliExpress isn't dying. It is evolving into a legitimate global retail competitor. And it is something we should keep an eye on, because as they build this global infrastructure, it will have ripple effects for everyone, not just the people buying $5 gadgets. It changes how goods move, how prices are set, and how factories operate.
Before we wrap up, I want to give a quick shout out to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that powered this show. We couldn't do these deep dives without their support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners and keeps us going.
We will be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, keep an eye on those checkout totals and maybe check for that choice badge.
See you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We shake